Thank you, Roger, and thank you to everyone who's come back after lunch. Those of us speaking after lunch now have the slightly daunting task of following such great papers in the morning. So here's my contribution. I'm going to be talking about black magic and the popular press. Between the 1890s and the Second World War, British readers developed a remarkable appetite for stories of black magic. There are several words in this which have to be said in this kind of voice, so if I move between the two, you'll know when I'm putting inverted commas in it. Stories of black magic, a term defined by its chief populariser Dennis Wheatley as the use of supernatural power for wicked or selfish ends. He actually italicises selfish. These lurid concoctions varied in style, but they shared a number of recurrent features. Intelligent, charismatic villains with resonant names rarely found in telephone directories, Lipsius, Haddo, Morcarta, personified the perils and allure of forbidden knowledge. Sometimes they acted alone, sometimes they led secret societies of malign intent which summoned the powers of darkness with mysterious rites, rituals and grimoires. Aided by innocent dupes or femme fatales, these men studied the so-called black arts, I'll stop doing it now, you've got the point, with intense scholarly devotion, and they forced their initially rationalistic and sceptical opponents to fight them with occult knowledge of their own, rather than rely upon ecclesiastical authorities or the police. Latin incantations, displays of strange powers, and women in peril completed the package. Few of these stories acquired any measure of literary respectability, but they were popular and, as we will see, widely influential. So this talk examines how popular fiction and sensational journalism overlapped from roughly the 1890s to the 1930s, in considering the relationship between the occult and the reading public. And here what Edgell was saying about mediatisation, I think it's a very helpful idea to bear in mind. At the end of the 19th century, a rebirth of interest in esotericism, which was such a feature of the intellectual climate of Britain, Western Europe and parts of the US, meant that the study of magic and other occult arts was no longer simply the preserve of eccentrics. Alongside them, it began to interest educated men and, importantly, women, whose spiritual, intellectual and psychological needs weren't met either by contemporary Christianity or by the scientific rationalism which emerged as its alternative. Membership of the Theosophical Society or the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, similar groups, may have been relatively limited, but they were influential in invigorating the study of things such as magic, the Kabbalah and the Tarot, as well as encouraging a wider interest in non-Western thought. And I think we could draw a rather tortuous parallel, but I'm going to do it anyway, between the membership of these groups and a remark that Brian Eno made about the Velvet Underground being the key word here. He said not many people bought their records, but everyone who did formed a band. And I think that there is a relationship between the teachings of small groups and the wider ripples across the cultural pond that those teachings cause. Almost contemporaneous with this quiet, underground cultural revolution is a much more brash and public rise of the tabloid newspaper. Reductions in paper duty, rising literacy rates, and technological advances made the production and dissemination of news ever easier and cheaper. And as the educational reforms of the 1870s bore fruit, Britain saw a growing number of daily and weekly newspapers prioritising sensational stories over more pedestrian concerns with verifiable accuracy. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Manchester Guardian saw themselves as informing and educating their readers. But a new generation of tabloids, the Daily Record, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Daily Mirror, which appeared between 1895 and 1903, was boisterously opinionated, often amusing. Tabloid journalism, and I'm using the word tabloid as an attitude, not just as a kind of measure of a newspaper's physical size, emphasised entertainment, a stance which had important consequences for the public profile and perception of so-called black magic. In offering this crude polarisation of the esoteric on one hand and the public tabloids on the other, I've downplayed writers who possessed an informed knowledge of occultism, Arthur Machen, for instance, or M.R. James. But stories such as James's Lost Hearts or Machen's novel The Three Impostors, both of which came out in the winter of 1895, shouldn't be seen as the ur-texts of black magic fiction in Britain, despite their malign sodalities, nocturnal rituals and sacrificial murders. Their magicians were pagan rather than satanic, their murderous activities discreet, and the stories themselves were not as aggressively marketed as those of a decade or so later, when the Golden Dawn member Algernon Blackwood published John Silence, and his publisher emblazoned omnibuses with adverts for it. It would be the fusion of newspapers and the occult which sparked a new generation of fiction, aimed much more obviously at popular genres than the antiquarianism of James or Machen's Stevensonian black comedy. Gothic is plagued by the law of diminishing returns. What scares one generation is often ridiculed by the next. Christopher Lee's first outing as Dracula is now a 12 certificate. It therefore constantly needs new material, and the popular press obliged. Newspaper reporting, especially if unconstrained by matters of accuracy, was itself Gothic fiction, even as it inspired Gothic writers. Law-abiding scholarly occultists such as A.E. Waite were of no interest to newspaper editors looking to boost their circulation. What propelled black magic into British households was the intersection of occultism and crime, and its coverage by the Daily Mail, the Sunday Express, the Illustrated Police News, and John Bull, newspapers which were cheap and which boasted, in the case of the Daily Mail at least, a circulation of 1.5 million by the mid-1920s. A resonant example of the ways in which the press shaped attitudes towards the occult is the coverage of the trial of Theo and Laura Horace, charged with rape, conspiracy and fraud at the Old Bailey in October 1901. Theo Horace, actually the less exotic Frank Jackson, and his wife Laura, the rather more exotic Editha Lolita, who claimed to be a daughter of Lola Montez, established the Theocratic and Purity League, a curious amalgam of theosophy and a marital bureau. Young women seeking husbands found themselves living in the Horus Temple in Gower Street, just over there, where they took part in mysterious rituals and were subjected to hypnosis and illegally applied sedatives before being sexually assaulted. Theo was found guilty of rape and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, while his wife, who called herself the Swami and appeared in court wrapped in yards of blue and white tulle, received a lesser sentence for assisting him. The Horus case plonked hitherto secret information onto breakfast tables across the land. The couple were clearly conversant with theosophy and some forms of ceremonial magic, as their league's initiation ceremony drew explicitly on that used by the Golden Dawn, an organisation the Daily Mail's reporter misheard as the Golden Door, which I suppose in some ways it was. The Golden Dawn's members swore on pain of death never to reveal their secrets, but in court witnesses told how Laura forced them to swear an almost identically worded obligation, which warned potential transgressors they should, quote, fall slain or paralysed without visible weapon, as if blasted by the lightning flash, if it were broken. The court heard a detailed description of other rites modelled on the Golden Dawns, and was shown magical objects, such as a red wooden cross and a sword, similar to those used by its initiates. When I was looking at Yeats's magical tools in an exhibition in Dublin a few years ago, somebody behind me was saying very insistently, but they're all homemade. Why are they homemade? And he was Yeats, he was a famous poet. He could have just gone out and... Anyway. Very few of the Daily Mail's readers had any prior knowledge of these activities and items, meaning that the paper's reports offered them a little knowledge, always a dangerous thing, I think, in occult circles. This cocktail of sex, drugs and esoteric ritual proved irresistible across the journalistic spectrum. As usual, the Times printed transcripts of court proceedings, but more popular papers mixed quotation with comment, describing hypnotism, blasphemy, drugged girls, and what the Mail called abracadabras of a dozen different kinds all mixed up. These accounts sent genuine members of the Golden Dawn scuttling for cover, appalled by the revelations and by the association of the order with such sleazy activities. The Horaces would not directly inspire subsequent writers, although Laura's physicality, she was apparently a very imposing presence, and gave her evidence as if appearing in grand opera. This physicality, distorted to monstrous proportions, became a characteristic of female adepts in some later writing, notably Dennis Wheatley's, and via him, James Herbert's novel like Portent, for instance. The Horace case was instrumental in establishing the supposed connections between magic, sex and drugs, but it paled beside the doings of another dissident Golden Dawn member, Edward Alexander Aleister Crowley, a man who would go far beyond Laura Horace in both theatricality and sexual excess. Crowley was made for the tabloids. His flamboyance, his appetite for publicity, his exuberant self-invention, and his elision of public and private lives were ideally suited to the appetites of a newspaper industry growing ever bolder in its coverage of topics once considered taboo. His initial celebrity came from his exploits as a mountaineer, and it was only after Somerset Maugham had met him in Paris in the winter of 1902 and depicted him as Oliver Haddo in his potboiler The Magician, 1908, that his notoriety began to take root. Crowley was amused by The Magician, or said he was, reviewing it for Vanity Fair, always good for publicity, under the pseudonym Oliver Haddo, and identifying some of its many plagiarisms. However, he can't have enjoyed his depiction as an obese and often tedious raconteur, a kind of cross between Count Fosco, G.K. Chesterton, and a past his sell-by-date Oscar Wilde. Maugham caricatured Crowley without mercy, grafting elements of his character and biography onto a tragic love story in which Haddo callously destroys a young couple's relationship, marrying the girl but keeping her in a state of unconsummated sexual hysteria so that she can take part in a magical ritual. Once again, magic was synonymous with perverse and transgressive sexuality. Maugham's intentions were brazenly commercial. Magic enticed the reading public, even if its details were repellent, and, in the best traditions of Gothic, because they were repellent. Are they all horrid, we might ask, echoing the Gothic readers in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey back in 1798. A product of the early tabloid era, The Magician combined sex, travel and crime to titillate the very appetites it purported to condemn. It was hypocritical in recounting the supposedly unspeakable horrors it was at pains to denounce, even if its occult knowledge was superficial, the result of frenzied cramming and plagiarism rather than informed study. Nevertheless, its successive reprints enshrined a version of Crowley in the popular consciousness, meaning that when he was written about at length in the years following the Great War, readers on both sides of the Atlantic already had an impression of him. Maugham dismissed the book, telling his agent that it was moonshine, but he had a popular novelist's, or journalist's, instinct for a good story, and The Magician became a valuable foundation for later writers who saw Crowley through its dark lenses, rather than actually reading him on his own terms. It was another decade or so before Crowley became a well-known figure in the mainstream British press, though his public profile and notoriety rose steadily through events such as his staging of the Rites of Eleusis in London in 1910, which made the front page of the New York Times. He spent the early years of the Georgian period travelling, mountaineering, writing, and experimenting with drugs and various sexual magical practices, leaving behind him a trail of emotional wreckage and accusations that he'd worked for Germany's intelligence services in the United States. By the time he returned to England in 1920, he was, in the words of the conservative tabloid John Bull, scum, notorious, and a traitor to boot. Though there aren't many scum notorious traitors who have 3 poems in the Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse, 1916, where Crowley is sandwiched, oddly enough, between G.K. Chesterton and the mystic Evelyn Underhill. Crowley's new project, the Abbey of Thelema, was summed up by Lawrence Sutin as a training ground, a college of the Holy Spirit, for disciples who demonstrated their resolve by making their way to its remote location and following its arduous routines. Through these disciples, Sutin writes, Crowley would found the new eon. They would help aid the Magus as the apostles had aided Jesus. The abbey was established in the Sicilian fishing village of Cephalou, fishers of men indeed. And between April 1920 and May 1923, when Mussolini expelled Crowley from Italy, it was the centre of wild rumour and speculation in the British press. It was events at Cephalou which would establish Crowley's Fleet Street moniker, the wickedest man in the world, ruining his reputation in supposedly respectable eyes, but cementing his position as a rebel and spiritual dissident. All manner of legends grew up around this small community. It was said that the abbey was a centre of Satanism and black magic. The two had suddenly become apparently synonymous and were used interchangeably. It was said that Crowley led his followers in rituals of unparalleled depravity, including sex with animals, that drug use was rife, and that the entire squalid enterprise was funded by prostituting its female members. A key figure in this was James Douglas, the editor of the Sunday Express, who spent the 1920s making war on all kinds of manifestations of permissiveness, the novels of Aldous Huxley, Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness. He edited the Sunday Express until 1931. And under him, the paper attacked Crowley with especial vehemence, usually on its front page, with headlines such as "New Sinister Revelations of Aleister Crowley, 25th February 1923. I dare you to pass by a newsstand and not pick that one up." As Richard Kaczynski, the most recent biographer of Crowley, shows, many of these tales were the work of the novelist Mary Butts, who'd lived at the Abbey but objected to the fictional presentation of herself and her lover in Crowley's novel Diary of a Drug Fiend. Other details were supplied or invented by the wonderful Betty May, who Kaczynski summarises as a thrice-married, cocaine-addicted pub singer whose friends nicknamed her the Tiger Woman. She was keen to avenge the death of her husband, Raoul Loveday, a victim of the Abbey's appallingly unsanitary conditions. It was a no-holds-barred presentation of this material in the English press, chiefly the Sunday Express and Horatio Bottomley's John Bull, which dogged Crowley for the rest of his life, and he'd pursue a variety of libel actions against those he felt had misrepresented him and his teachings. The version of Crowley created by British newspapers during and after the Cephalou episode established his fictional persona and placed black magic, couldn't resist it, black magic once again at the centre of English Gothic. The headlines screamed out, "A wizard of wickedness, the wickedest man in the world, king of depravity, and a man we'd like to hang." But however baleful his presentation on the front page of John Bull, there are limits to the mischief an asthmatic, drug-addicted man in his late 40s can get up to. And Crowley caused a lot less trouble than Horatio Bottomley, millionaire fraudster, the Robert Maxwell character of his day. Crowley had put himself into Diary of a Drug Fiend and his virtual rewrite of the magician, Moonchild, but he could only watch as the version of him created by the newspapers began to achieve a life independent of its inspiration. This fictional magician was, one might suggest, the Moonchild that Haddo and Crowley had sought to create, but over which Crowley now had no control. In the aftermath of the Cephalou episode, literary Crowley started springing up like warriors from the dragon's teeth, helped by the cinematic adaptation of The Magician, which arrived in cinemas in 1926. The same year, we saw a character called Shelley Arabine, a disreputable poet who features in John Buchan's novel The Dancing Floor, an extension of a story he wrote in 1914. Both Basilisa, the original story, and The Dancing Floor tell pretty much the same story. An English visitor to Greece rescues a beautiful young woman from superstitious villagers who think she's a witch. But the 1926 version incorporates new material clearly inspired by Crowley's growing infamy. The girl, Corey Arabine, is clearly, her father is clearly modelled on Crowley. His name, Shelley, alludes obviously to Percy Bysshe Shelley, whose verse Crowley imitated and whose unconventional sexual, spiritual and anti-authoritarian attitudes left a profound impression upon him. Arabine apparently, quote, carried Swinburne and Baudelaire a step further, another allusion to Crowley's literary influences. Arabine devoted his life to, quote, researches in devilry. Most notably of all, Arabine's bedroom is decorated with frescoes that suggest he has, quote, worshipped darker gods than Priapus. The walls show Pan and his satyrs and a bevy of nymphs and strange figures, half animal, half human, engaged in a carnival of bestiality. This echoes the main ritual room at Cephalou, where Crowley, inspired by Gauguin's Tahitian murals, decorated with sexually explicit paintings and called it La Chambre de Cauchemar, the bedroom of nightmares. Crowley sought to make his students meditate on Judeo-Christian taboos in order to destroy their power. But Buchan's story has no time for this kind of psychotherapeutic speculation and simply employs Crowley's media image as convenient shorthand for sexual deviance. Arabine is a bohemian writer, the man Crowley might have been if he hadn't devoted so much of his life to magic. H.R. Wakefield's Oscar Clinton, however, is a much more direct transcription of Crowley's contemporary reputation. Having worked in newspapers and publishing, he was secretary to the Daily Mail's founder, Lord Northcliffe. Wakefield was, like Buchan and Somerset Maugham, very much aware of how popular fiction needed topicality to succeed in the marketplace. And his first collection of ghost stories, They Return at Evening, 1928, exploited this knowledge to the full. The book's most well-known story, He Cometh and He Passeth By, is, in plot terms, a rewrite of M.R. James's story, Casting Runes. In James's story, an occultist called Carswell, sometimes erroneously suggested to be based on Crowley, kills an enemy by planting on him a strip of runic lettering, which springs forth a murderous demon. In Wakefield's updated variant, Clinton cuts a silhouette of a hideous shadowy figure, which he dispatches on murderous errands. But He Cometh is not a simple imitation of the earlier story. Wakefield quite deliberately plays off Crowley's notoriety and the growing public interest in stories of sex, magic, and hidden knowledge. Whereas James and Machen had associated magic with paganism, Wakefield was quite explicit about its satanic intentions. Clinton, an accomplished corrupter, is the high priest of, quote, an esoteric and little-known sect, Satanists, and he uses his psychic powers and occult knowledge to travel the world, eliciting money from gullible women. He's only vanquished when a friend of one of his victims learns how to unleash the silhouette demon against him. This makes for an emotionally satisfying finale to the story, but its implications are disquieting, for Clinton seems to be above the law and can only be punished by other, darker powers. He Cometh demonizes and yet trivializes Crowley, acknowledging and even magnifying his powers, while simultaneously relegating him to the status of a promiscuous confidence trickster. Maugham had veiled the connection between Crowley and Wilde, but Wakefield was again explicit, both through that choice of forename and through his comment that Clinton belongs to the 90s, Raptures and Roses, Absinthe and Posies, and the other Oscar. Reviewing Arthur Symons' translations of Baudelaire in 1928, T.S. Eliot had observed, for Swinburne's disciples, the men of the 90s, evil was very good fun. Clinton fits firmly within this frame, but readers lacking a knowledge of literary history will be quite capable of recognising his inspiration simply by having seen those Sunday Express front pages. Clinton boasts of his outlandish sexual exploits, his drug use, his contempt for morality, his magical prowess. Expelled from various foreign countries, he possesses brooding hypnotic eyes and a powerful mountaineer's torso. He even has something of Crowley's curious coiffure and shares his fondness for expensive stationery and coloured ink. Crowley would surely have sued for libel if he'd been aware of the story. By the time He Cometh appeared, black magic was becoming an increasingly familiar topic in the press and making more and more appearances in Gothic fiction. The association with Satanism suddenly seemed all but axiomatic. Mystics and occultists were incorporating serious discussion of magic within plot-driven thrillers, such as Charles Williams' The War in Heaven and Dion Fortune's The Demon Lover, also The Secrets of Dr. Taverner. But other writers introduced versions of Crowley into much less serious stories, Warwick Deeping's Exiles, for instance. But none of these could rival the final thing I'm going to talk about in the last 5 minutes or so of this talk, the immense commercial success of Dennis Wheatley's The Devil Rides Out. There's 6 years between He Cometh and He Passeth By and the serialisation of Wheatley's story in the Daily Mail, of all places. It began its serialisation on Halloween 1934. In these 6 years, Crowley had conducted a series of unsuccessful court actions. These kept his name before the public, but only succeeded in further blackening his reputation and draining what little remained in his coffers. Ethel Mannin's Confessions and Impressions, 1930, branded Crowley that high priest of black magic, his satanic majesty, the prince of darkness. But his libel action wasn't considered until 1933, by which date sufficient time had elapsed since the book's publication to render a libel action untenable. He brought another case against the artist's model Nina Hamnet for her memoir Laughing Torso, 1932. This recycled rumours of child sacrifice, but again, Crowley's action was unsuccessful. The case, widely reported in the press in April 1934, saw Crowley denouncing black magic and making it clear that, as he didn't operate within Christian confines, he could hardly be a Satanist, even if he did identify with the great beast of Revelation. As Phil Baker explains in his biography of Wheatley, the Daily Mail's serialisation of The Devil Rides Out was prompted by a sense not just that magic was a fashionable topic for thrillers, but also that a Manichean struggle between the forces of light and darkness was imminent. The claim that an English occultist with very few followers might be the wickedest man in the world was risible in the age of Mussolini, Stalin and Hitler. But Dennis Wheatley was unconcerned. He saw instead the narrative potential of a story which transferred elements of Crowley's character to a far grander stage than London drawing rooms and squalid Sicilian villages. Making artful use of material from adventure stories and thrillers, and even grafting on a love story of sorts, Wheatley's tale undoubtedly lived up to the Daily Mail's billing. Startling, provocative, romantic. Chapters entitled Embodied Evil, Evil Triumphant, and The Satanist promised a compelling blend of mystery and excitement. The Devil Rides Out made Satanists responsible for the cataclysm of the First World War. The power of darkness is still a living force, says Wheatley's hero, the Duc de Richelieu. It is worshipped by depraved beings for their unholy ends in the great cities of Europe and America to this very day. One of these depraved souls is Damien Morcarta, a defrocked priest who has Crowley's hypnotic eyes and his baldness combined with a mastery of the black arts. He shares Oliver Haddo's grotesque corporeality. He's pot-bellied and suggestive of a large white slug. Morcarta claims, in magic, there is neither good nor evil. It is only the science of causing change to occur by means of will. However, his purist position is contradicted by his actions. He's a highly dangerous adept who is even prepared to perform human sacrifice in the pursuit of his satanic goals. Wheatley's knowledge, like Morm's, was a combination of cribbing and invention, but his details were atmospheric and served to establish him as an authority on occult matters for the next 40 years. So, to conclude, newspapers and popular fiction have had a close association since the Newgate novels of the 1830s were accused of glamorising crime. And this association has often served to devalue words such as truth or fact, post-truth now, and post-fact. What Edgar Wallace might have called the case of a black magic bogeyman is a case in point, with a wide variety of beliefs and practices being seen through the distorting lens of Crowley's extravagant public image. One might wonder if this played any part in Evelyn Waugh's ferocious satire of Fleet Street, Scoop, from 1938. For as an inveterate reader of newspapers and sometime journalist, Waugh would have been well aware of Crowley's regular appearances on the front pages. It may have been this insistent coverage that inspired his choice of name for Lord Copper's profoundly unethical and sensational newspaper, the Daily Beast. Thank you.